Hey, 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 everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you. Today, we've got a lot to talk about. And as we get into the conversation, remember, this is the last full week where you will be able to get registered to vote. It's important to note that because in Texas alone, 1 million people have been purged from the voter rolls. The sad part is so many of us don't even know that we've been purged. And there has been a target of at least 2 million people that the right wing are looking to purge. One of our listeners actually uh, said, you told us to look into our voter registration just to check to see if we're still current. He said it turns out I had been kicked off because I put street instead of drive on my identify when I filled out the form. So they're looking for ways, everybody. So please go to vote.org. I've been checking every day. Go to vote.org. It doesn't even take 2 minutes. And if you find that you've been purged, you can also get registered there. And furthermore, you can find out if your state will allow same day on site registration and what the cutoff date is. The cutoff date in South Carolina is the 4th. And in other states, it goes up to the 7th. So you need to find that out. So please, everybody, like and share the show. I know I'm coming on a lot earlier today. We're moving things around, but it's get out the vote time. And, I have been on the road. In fact, I'm going on the road tomorrow to Michigan. And so I will see you there. But we're going to be talking about a wider war. It's almost a year since the horrors of October 7th, but it's been decades since the horrors of the Nakba that has never ended for the Palestinian people. So, what is going on really? What is going on now? We see that with 2,000-pound bombs that the United States has supplied to the IDF, they have not only killed Hassan Nasrallah, who was a moderate leader of Hezbollah, but they flattened 3 buildings and severely damaged another. So, what's really going on here and how is it being reported? And if boots from Americans go on the ground, are you willing to do that? We already have 50,000 troops in the area. And it has already been stated that if any of our troops get hit by fire, they will fire back. So, what is that going to mean? We've got a lot of talk, we've got a lot to talk about, and I've got people much smarter than I who are here to talk about it because I don't know. I don't know. Of course, we have Dr. David Gibbs from the University of Arizona, Professor David Gibbs. I'm grabbing him from his classes, but I'm so glad that he's with us. And of course, get his book, The Revolt of the Rich. So much of where we are right now, he really tracks it because every action merits an equal and opposite reaction. And after the civil rights movement and all of these human rights movements, really, which is the revolt of the 99%, you did have a revolt of the rich who said, now, you know what, we're going to peel back all of these advances that these people have made, and that's what we're watching. But you need to track it. And so, in order to understand it, reminding you also to look at the vice presidential debate tomorrow night. We will be talking about that on Wednesday. So let's get right to it, everybody. Please go to the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. Please become my friend there and go to the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Like and subscribe, like and subscribe. Hey, Laura, everybody, please like and subscribe, and then share the show. Share it, share it, share it, share it. And of course, I'm at Santita J on X. Of course, we have Dr. David Gibbs, but I have someone new to the tribe today. I'm so excited to have Professor Gregory Shupak. I'm so glad. How are you, Professor of English and Media Relations? And he can help us to understand what the real story is. I just ordered his book today, and I cannot wait to have you back to talk about it. The Wrong Story: Palestine, Israel, and the Media. That I really want to read. I've expedited the shipping of the book just so that you know, because I'm wondering about that. What about the story? And of course, you're at Algoma University currently. And so let's get right to it because I'm trying to find out before I get to you, Professor Shupak, just Dr. Gibbs, we're in the election season. Everything is getting cranked up. We've got the vice presidential debate coming up tomorrow. By the time people hear this, it will be later on in the evening. I'm wondering will this come up at the vice presidential debate? Should it come up at the vice presidential debate? Are you anticipating a wider war? I mean, what is going on here?
Well, I think that the United States has always been, since the early '70s, since the Nixon administration, played a crucial role in what's going on in the Middle East. In that Israel was selected as America's proxy in the Middle East. Nixon had this policy of trying, after the debacle of Vietnam, trying to build up allies in certain regions as a proxy for American power. Israel was selected for that purpose in the Middle East based upon what seemed to be a competent military, and was given enormous military resources and critically economic aid on an unprecedented level. There was an Israel lobby, but you might say the Israel lobby was, in a sense, pushing on an open door because American policy was predisposed already to back Israel on strategic grounds. And that's endured for 50 years, even after the original purpose of this alliance wore off. The vested interests surrounding it now kept propelling it into the 21st century. You have politicians like Joseph Biden, whose whole career has been steeped in pro-Israel attitudes. And the effect on Israel has been that, first of all, Israel has been able to pursue a policy of military victory at the expense of any kind of permanent diplomatic settlement, almost as a matter of principle, that military force solves all problems. This is certainly the view of Netanyahu and the people surrounding him. It is the predominant view in the Israeli political establishment that you don't need to negotiate with your enemies or compromise in any way whatsoever, because enough military force will intimidate them or defeat them outright. And critical to that assumption is that the United States will always back Israel. And so far, that assumption has proven correct from the Israeli standpoint. It's enabled Israel to engage in a kind of military strategic stance, an order of battle, as they say in the military, that's based on very high risk activity, on the assumption that if they get into any kind of trouble, the U.S. will bail them out, as the U.S. has done repeatedly. And it's bailing them out now. The United States has repeatedly, during this current war, since October 7th of last year, has been supplying Israel with everything they need to stay in the war. Without U.S. support, Israel could not possibly be pursuing the policies it is pursuing. And the Israelis do seem to take the view that there is nothing they can do that the U.S. will not ultimately back them up on. The United States, you see Tony Blinken, our very moralistic and self-righteous Secretary of State, wringing his hands, expressing great regret about the enormous casualties, the immense loss of civilian life, the death of children, the recent attacks in Beirut, I think what killed 1,000 people, most of them civilians. I'm sure he'll wring his hands about that too and scold Israel and wag his finger. But he will not do what is really necessary to take charge of the situation, which is to cut off aid to Israel, or at least credibly threaten to cut off aid to Israel. That would force Israel to change its policy, and that is something the United States has not done, and as far as I can tell, will not do at any point in the future. Both parties seem to be staunchly behind Israel, and Kamala Harris may be using some vague rhetoric that is mildly critical of Israel, or very mildly, but at no point has she said there are any circumstance under which we'll cut off U.S. aid to Israel. And I think what Israel is trying to do, and sometimes quite openly, many of its officials have been talking about this for a while now, is basically bring America directly into the war in Lebanon and possibly with Iran. The United States is not going to use ground forces. I don't think it's going to send boots on the ground, as they say, at least not regular ground forces. That would be so unpopular. I can't imagine the U.S. would do that. What it could do is start using its massive air and sea power in support of Israel, especially if Iran becomes involved in the war, which it may. We're seeing in the short term is Israel, by all indications, is preparing a ground offensive into Lebanon. It's going to be a very tricky operation. I mean, the Hezbollah sustained a lot of losses, but they still have buried in underground bunkers over 150,000 rockets they could launch against the Israelis, which the Israelis would not be able to fully intercept. They could do a lot of damage to Israel's infrastructure if they did that. Plus, there were enormous tunnels all over southern Lebanon that would make it very difficult for Israeli ground forces to operate and cause very high casualties among the IDF. And once again, there's always the possibility that Hezbollah's main international backer, Iran, could become much more directly involved in the war than they've become already. There are all sorts of ways this could escalate. I mean, Yemen obviously has become involved in the war. You could have any number of outbreaks against pro-American leaders, beginning with al-Sisi in Egypt or Abdullah in Jordan, being, possibly threatened by a popular uprising. I'm not saying this will happen, but it certainly could happen. That's a very high risk here. You could get a spike in terrorism all over the world, any part of the world, by any number of groups. So this is a very high risk proposition. America is already paying a high price, very high price, for this unconditional support of Israel. And given the escalation we're seeing now and likely to further escalation, there could be enormous blowback, not just for Israel, but for the United States. And I'm very surprised that there's been so little effort by the American political and military establishment to rein Israel in and to seek some kind of ceasefire and political solution. But there seems to be no appetite in Washington to do so.
What do you think? Where do you think the American public will go with this? Because there's been a sea change in American public opinion since October 7th of 2023. I could hear it almost seemed pretextual because it appeared that the narrative was going to go in one direction, but Americans went 180 degrees from that, particularly our young people.
Right.
And so now you have open discussions about AIPAC, undue influence on our public policy, our international policy, our elections. I mean, all of that. I mean, that is something that was something you dare not have mentioned 10 months ago. Well, excuse me, now about 12 months ago, but now it's here. So what do you see?
Are you asking me or?
No, I'm asking you. I'm asking you. And then I'm
right. I think that you have indeed seen a real shift in public opinion. I mean, just the scale of what has been going on in Gaza and now what's going on in Lebanon, what's going on in the West Bank, the enormous loss of life, the brazen callousness of what Israel is doing, and doing it with American backing, critically, with American backing. It is taking a toll on Israel's reputation, not just in this country, but worldwide. You are indeed seeing a shift in tone, again, especially among the very young, including in the Jewish community, which is showing some real splits never seen before, to some extent along age group. Probably the biggest, most important constituency backing Israel, as far as I can tell, remains evangelical Christians. On religious grounds, a lot of them continue to back Israel with in some ways even more enthusiastically than many Jews. At least that's my impression. There seems to be, among at least some elements of the evangelical community, and again, I'm not saying I understand this at a theological level, but just polling shows significant elements of evangelical Christians have a kind of animus against the Muslim religion. Maybe that's oversimplifying, but that's my impression. There's a significant element of that. So you do get these kind of complicated politics in the United States. But again, the prospect of dead children, dismembered babies, and deliberate targeting of civilians that we've seen again and again by the Israelis, the horrific consequences of what they're doing, it does have an impact. And in the era of cell phones and so on, Israel is limited in its ability to contain the fallout from these things. At the same time, decades of, I have to be frank here, pro-Israel propaganda have had their impact overall, not just on the evangelicals, but more broadly. And there's still a sizable percentage of the U.S. population that kind of likes Israel, regards Israel as quote unquote more like us, whatever that means, than the Arab states are.
They're white, English speaking.
Well, that's right. I think there is an element of that. Yes, they quote unquote look like us, act like us. Or at least that's the way it's presented. That's the way, and yes, that does have an impact. But it's being eroded, and there's a question of how much longer can this go on. Also, there's something else here too, which is polls show again that along party lines, the party that much more strongly backs them in terms of adherence is the Republican Party. People who vote Republican more strongly back Israel than those who vote Democratic. And that's a bit ironic because, the mantra The Republican Party has been America first. Let's put America's interest first. And at least some Republicans, this varies a lot, but some, Tulsi Gabbard is now essentially Republican, has again and again condemned the warmongers, condemned endless wars. You hear some of that occasionally intermittently from J.D. Vance. But for some reason, Israel is exempted from that. And so there's a remarkable inconsistency in the Republican Party that they're for America first and everything except Israel. At least some of them claim to be against endless wars and against the warmongers. Again, Israel is exempted. Now, how long will this go on before I think people start realizing this is a contradiction, an inconsistency, and that, it concerns people rightly have that American resources are being used for overseas wars. The massive amounts of money we're spending in Ukraine, as well as the massive amounts of money we're spending in the Middle East, could be better used, maybe, arguably, to rebuild some cities in the Midwest, to rural areas around the country, or the island of Maui after the fires of 2 years ago. I mean, all of these things have a real cost to the public, and that too is going to take its toll. And I can't imagine Israel can get away with this in the long term. I'm very surprised at how long this has gone on, this unconditional American backing, but it's hard for me to believe this can go on forever.
Things never do. And which brings us to all of this cues it up for you, Professor Gregory Shupak. Of course, your book, The Wrong Story. I was so struck by that before we even get to the colon, Palestine, Israel, and the media. The wrong story. And it seems that I'm getting the sense that Americans have felt that they've had the wrong story because we like to pull for the underdog. I mean, that's just part of it. I think that's an American thing, and I think it's a human thing. But Americans are really, we're into that, and particularly those of us who've come over to this part of the world. All of us, Canadian, North American, and the white Mexicans, if you will, because indigenous Mexicans are indigenous people who are dark. All of us over here. I'm wondering, it seems like the story, they say truth crushed to the earth will always rise. Help me to understand how we've gotten the story wrong. Because I'm asking this question because it seems like they're talking about, they're in Lebanon. The IDF is in Lebanon. They're looking at Yemen. They're talking about Iran. Oh my gosh, this is frightening. I'd like for you to help us because the media, they're trying to shape the narrative, but now more and more Americans don't trust them. And not just Americans. I think most of us, the zeitgeist puts us in a mistrustful mood of authority, period. So, Professor Shupak, you've got it. Everybody get the book, The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the media.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate your kind words about the book, and also thank you so much for having me. Yeah, there's a lot that one can say about this. Sort of the premise of that book, which I think continues to apply to the coverage we're seeing now, is that it doesn't make sense to, when we're thinking about the role of media in society, to just consider each article, each headline, each news clip on TV or radio as its own sort of distinct unit. Rather, it's worth considering the ways that these coalesce into relatively coherent narratives over time, and how a lot of these frames that are applied to communicate information and ideas about the world seem to have really consistent characteristics over time. And those characteristics are pretty severely flawed when we're talking about the way that mainstream media, corporate media deal with certainly Palestine and the rest of the region. And I think this is true for coverage of the whole world, really. But to keep focused here, I would say that with regard to Palestine, I talk about how there's a real inversion at times that suggests either they're either Israelis are the victims, or depending on what time period of coverage you look at, that both sides are, kind of responsible for the violence to a comparable degree, and both sides have suffered from each other to a comparable extent. That doesn't, stand up to any scrutiny, as certainly the last year has, I think, really made it hard for anyone to defend that position, even as some do. But I also talk about ways to to properly, in my view, understand the way that Palestine, Israel actually has come to be in the state that it's in, and that I think has very little to do with a lot of the explanations you hear, which explain the dynamics in terms of cultural difference between Jewish people and Arab people, or Jewish people and Muslim people, and much more to do with Israel's being a settler colonial entity, and with its function as the attack dog for American empire, certainly in the Middle East, but also in many other cases around the world. If you don't go back, you don't have to go back very far to see Israel, helping arm right-wing death squads in Latin America, for example, on behalf of America, in effect, to skirt congressional bans on doing so. And I also in the book talk about the fact that you get a lot of, and I think this has been very pertinent post October 7th, a lot of defenses of Israeli war crimes that describe what Israel's doing in terms of so-called self-defense. And again, I don't think that holds up to scrutiny for many reasons. One of them being that, Israel is an occupying power. Occupying powers do not have self-defense against the right to self-defense against the populations that they occupy. We never hear any indulgence of, or any notion, I should say, of the idea that Palestinians or any Arab peoples have a right to resist or defend themselves against Israeli-U.S. aggression, even though under international law, people living under colonial occupation do have a right to resist, including up to and including armed struggle. So I think that, casting Israel as defending itself in perpetuity really just glosses over the, underlying dynamics of 76 years of Nakba and, Zionist / European / American colonization of Palestine dating back to the late 19th century. And so I think that those are some of the basic frameworks that news media provides for approaching Palestine, Israel, and they're all deeply misguided, as I'm trying to suggest. I think that there are that a lot of these narratives then bleed over into or are redeployed to cover scenarios like we see in Lebanon. So, since October 8th, up until the more recent intensification of Israeli strikes, Israel had carried out 83% of the airstrikes that had taken place between Hezbollah and Israel. And so, that kind of, I think, gives lie to the idea that what Israel's doing and has been doing can be seen as self-defense. And more to the point, we're seeing very little mention of what Israel has been doing in terms of, flattening civilian residences in Lebanon. We're seeing really little mention of the fact that Hezbollah, right up until the last hours of Hassan Nasrallah's life, has been tying its actions to a ceasefire in Gaza. They've refused to say, okay, we will, essentially leave Israel alone, and as if they leave us alone. They're saying, no, we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop supporting the Palestinian struggle. So that the fact that Hezbollah's military actions have been, the fact that we have been provided by media almost no sense of the fact that Hezbollah's actions have been pretty explicitly tied to stopping Israel from committing genocide against the Palestinians. That's a pretty important piece of information for making sense of what's going on. And that's really been, MIA in the media coverage. And likewise, we have a real, as you see with no matter who the enemy is, that the enemy of the moment is for America and its partners, the media provides us with a really cartoonish demonization of Hezbollah that, doesn't really enable any public understanding of the organization and how it fits into Lebanese society. So, you would think from people like Bret Stephens in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal that Hezbollah is, to use Stephens's word, has quote unquote hijacked Lebanon. But I mean, there's a lot of internal division in Lebanon, no doubt. But I mean, Hezbollah was the party that held a parliamentary majority after the 2018 elections in Lebanon. And although it lost that majority in the 2022 elections, it still was Hezbollah and its allies, the pro-Hezbollah bloc still after 2022 held the most, more seats than any other party or bloc in the Lebanese legislature. So to just reduce it to sort of a band of thugs that's holding Lebanon hostage really does not in any way equip audiences to have an accurate appreciation of how that movement fits within Lebanese society. So, those are a few initial observations, but I mean, I think fundamentally the most important thing is that we're getting really outright endorsement and celebration across a lot of the news media of, say the strikes against Nasrallah that killed Nasrallah, or the other Hezbollah leaders who have been taken out. There's a totally just casual disregard for the lives of Lebanese people, right? Like, you would think that, setting aside the fact that I wouldn't, support bumping off the leaders of Hezbollah anyway, but even if that's all that was, if you read the media, you might think that that's all that's happening, that they're not also, bombing border crossings that Lebanon shares with Syria so that it's impossible or difficult to get ambulances and aid into Lebanon from Syria. You wouldn't have any sense of the scale of people being in Lebanon, incinerated by 2,000-pound bombs that America has provided. This is all just subsumed under the phrase we always hear to describe Israeli strikes on Lebanon, which is that they're bombing, quote unquote, Hezbollah targets. Well, they're bombing a heck of a lot else too.
Well, I'm trying to find out, what the narrative that we're not getting. And I'll switch this back to you, Dr. Gibbs, as Professor Schupak just so brilliantly laid out. The IDF goes after civilian targets as readily as they go after military targets. Not only is this a bad look for Israel across the world, America is seen as absolutely being complicit. But we did not see last week, when Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke at the UN, was that he spoke to an empty room. The cheers that we heard were from the observers gallery. When they panned the audience, barely anybody was there. People actually got up and walked out when he walked in. That is, and now they're escalating, not just on Gaza and the West Bank. They're moving into Lebanon. We've seen this before. They said in 92, I think, was it Mousawi, when they shot him, when they killed him, they said, we've ended Hezbollah. That did not happen. It strengthened it. Oh, this narrative, Dr. Gibbs, the way that they're doing this is making things infinitely worse, I think. Yeah. And they turned down Hezbollah's offer for a ceasefire. They said, if you stop bombing us, and Professor Schupak, that's not being reported. that an offer, but they didn't do that with Ukraine either. They put the ceasefire offer on the table. They said, look, no mas, no mas. If you stop, we'll stop. Dr. Gibbs.
Yeah, I think that the Israeli strategy has always been to avoid any political solution and seek a military solution completely on their terms. The military defeat is what they are seeking, a generalized military defeat. That's virtually impossible. I mean, you can't defeat all the Arab world, all the Muslim world simultaneously. And it's almost looking like Israel is coming pretty close to that at this point, especially when you consider not just Arab leadership, but the Arab street and how people feel about this in the Arab street, which is getting very tense. What I would focus on more than anything else is not only the moral issue of Israel targeting civilians deliberately in many cases and causing immense civilian death with utter callousness, but also its effect on the United States. That is the United States that is making all of this possible. And this inevitably will and must reflect on the United States, since the U.S. is behind the whole thing from A to Z. And no matter how much Tony Blinken may wag his finger in utter moralistic rhetoric, the fact is that it is the United States that's making all of this possible. And, I would think back to the 2001 terrorist attacks that killed 3,000 people, which were terrible. Just as many terrorist acts are always terrible, but they didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of a situation where the U.S. had been backing Israel for decades. And so much of the Arab world, including extremists like bin Laden, saw the need to strike at the United States. Partly, and he said in his own statement, it was published in The Guardian, America's support for Israel was one of the principal reasons that he had other reasons too, but one of the principal reasons was America's support for Israel. And that's a perfectly plausible in terms of his motive. Obviously, of course, that doesn't justify what he did. But that's a separate issue from America's support for Israel is damaging U.S. security. It's having a real impact on the United States. And so, there's a big question of whether or not either party here is really adequately addressing the needs of the public for A, security, and B, not to have its money wasted supporting aggressive, unnecessary wars. The U.S. officially has been supporting the two-state solution for decades, since at least the Oslo Accords in 1993. But it means nothing because the United States will never force Israel to actually implement the Oslo Accords in any meaningful way. Israel has been trying to undermine the Oslo Accords, certainly since Netanyahu came to power. And, there's been no penalty for that. The Biden administration and both candidates for the presidency, as far as I can tell, are all very much guilty of making this whole calamity possible, with not only disastrous results to the people of the Middle East, but also for the public in the United States.
Professor Shupak, what has the narrative shifted for the American public? I mean, or do you see any change on the horizon? I mean, that would shift policy. Because, I'm hearing, we hear the discussion. We're watching the uncommitted delegates who are now publicly coming out and they're saying we will not support Kamala Harris, which is endangering Michigan. I don't care what the media are telling us. The media are saying, oh, she's moving ahead. I'm like, how is she moving ahead? Gaza is, and the media are also telling us that Gaza doesn't matter to people. I said, that's not true. I listen to Washington Journal in the mornings on C-SPAN, and I enjoy that because they just open up the phone lines. You have a neutral host, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and you even have our brothers and sisters from the North, from Canada, who chime in. And I love that because I get a chance to hear what they're saying. Gaza is an issue. The economy is an issue. All these things are issues, but the narrative is not, I don't think we're getting the right narrative. And when I say the right narrative, I'm not saying a narrative with which I agree. I'm saying an accurate narrative that could help. We have 50,000 troops, the United States does, in that part of the world. They are in danger because they are surrounded by people who are growing increasingly resentful of them. And these people have been very careful not to blame Americans for America's policies because they understand what we go through. But more increasingly, I'm not sure that's going to hold up, Professor Schupak.
Yeah, well, in terms of narrative, which you asked about, I would say that I think that we're seeing, you know, very minimal shifts in sort of corporate mainstream media. I think with the genocide in Gaza, we've seen the horror has been so virtually apocalyptic that at a certain point, especially in an era where there's social media and people can access what folks on the ground are filming with their phones, it's very difficult for sort of ruling class media to just pretend that that doesn't exist and out and out lie about it. So there have been cracks on the edifice, or in the edifice, excuse me, over time over the last year. With Lebanon, I'm seeing mostly just what I described earlier, the reversion to sort of simplistic demonization of the evildoer of the moment, Hezbollah in this case, and as I said, disregard for at best the lives of Lebanese people, if not outright endorsement of killing more of them. I would say that at the same time, there is social space that didn't exist in the past, or I should say greater social space in terms of media, because we've always had independent media, but it is easier to circulate that much more quickly and on a larger scale than it was in the past, in the electronic age. So I think that especially among younger people, there is, mainstream media just carries a lot less legitimacy. And that's one of the significant reasons that support for U.S. imperialism, including its support for Israel, has a lot less legitimacy amongst younger people. I mean that I don't want to suggest this is totally new. That was obviously questioned in Vietnam and at other points in history. But I do think that it has weakened the sort of corporate control of the narrative to have a little bit more discursive space for alternative voices to get through. And so I think that is one thing that has helped the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which I think has done a good job of expanding to include opposition to U.S.-Israeli war crimes in Lebanon. I would say that I think that if there is to be a sort of actual shift in U.S. policy, it's going to come from major pressure from below amongst the American population, and that I would not expect at all conventional mainstream media to help drive that in any way. We saw this throughout the student movements in support of Gaza and Palestine more broadly in the last year. I mean, a huge campaign of baseless demonization of the students. I think, though, that it is certainly possible, as it always has been, to mobilize large numbers of people to oppose their own government's participation in genocide and in international aggression and occupation, which we've seen. I mean, even just keeping to the last year across West Asia, or the Middle East, as it's more often called.
Dr. Gibbs.
Yes.
We're basically 4 weeks from the election. Where do you see this going? Because now, I mean, was just coming across my, all these things come across your newswire. My phone keeps buzzing with all these polls that everybody's taking every 5 minutes. Dr. Gibbs, Professor Schupak, and Harris is down 10 points in Arizona. 10 points.
Oh.
And you're in Arizona. Is that surprising to you?
It's not. I mean, Trump has always had the edge here. I don't think Gaza is a critical issue here. I think in Michigan, it could very well be a critical issue. I don't think it's the main issue here.
Is the border more of an issue?
Border, immigration, okay. Including, immigration is a complicated issue. And again, we like to think of this as one that neatly divides people along racial lines, and it doesn't. A significant part of the Hispanic community is concerned about immigration, and so that is a bit more complicated. But the economy is a main issue. But one of the things I suspect that it's a secondary issue all over the country is a sense that the world is spinning out of control, and that on Biden's watch and Harris's watch, you have had more instability globally than you've had in a long time.
Mm.
And I think this is not going to be as decisive as the economy or immigration or other things like that. The domestic issues are always come to the fore, but I suspect in the back of people's minds, the Democrats will be hurt by the perception of sort of an unstable world that does seem to be getting worse and worse. And if there's another escalation in the Middle East, it seems extremely likely, and in fact is happening before our eyes. I think that could work in Trump's favor. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I myself don't support either party, so I don't have political endorsements like that. But increased instability is likely to be a more positive Republican issue than a Democratic issue right now. And what's happening in Lebanon is only likely to make that worse. For what it's worth, I mean, I would guess Netanyahu would feel more comfortable probably with either candidate, but he'd feel more comfortable with Trump because Trump is more rigidly pro-Israel than Harris is. Trump's constituency is more strongly supportive of Israel. So I'm assuming the Israeli right, led by Netanyahu, is rooting for Trump in this election, although I don't think he'd be terribly disappointed by a President Harris either. So I don't think it is that much to worry about in terms of the presidential race. It could be something that could hurt the Democrats. It could increase support for third-party candidacies. Cornel West is not on the ballot here in Arizona, but Jill Stein will be. And I suspect it probably will increase at the margin some support for her. And in places, again, like Michigan, where this could very possibly be the decisive issue.
Well, I mean, Professor Shupak, not that you want to get involved in, American politics, but, media is something you study. Where do you see this narrative going? And where do you see the public going with the narrative? Look, we have seen millions of people all throughout the world marching about this particular issue, but they're also marching about the economy. I mean, the people, if you will, the 99% are restless and they seek relief. I heard someone say that before, opening up a presidential speech. And a pillar, I mean, the only protected class of workers in the United States in our Constitution, it's the press. And now Americans don't trust it. I mean, overwhelmingly. What is the impact on that? I mean, I think, maybe because you have a little bit of distance from us, I think you can help us a bit. What does that look like to you?
Well, I mean, it's only somewhat more intense of a dynamic that exists here in Canada and elsewhere, that mistrust of media. And I think it's difficult to map exactly what the effects of it are, because they are kind of multi-directional in the sense that people on the left and the right generally, distrust at best and have contempt for, in many other cases, traditional mainstream media, albeit for different reasons a lot of the time. So as for the effects, I mean, yeah, it's again difficult to sort of predict what the way in which that will affect the American election. I think that you do have a lot of I think that the major kind of legacy media outlets, with of course the exception of Fox News, which is a big exception, are pretty thoroughly in favor of Harris. And I think that does, I mean, I guess the Wall Street Journal is a bit of an exception there too, but they're that does have an effect. But I think that people's kind of daily realities do shape them more than news media when it comes to local issues. So I think my sense it's hard to sort of prove or measure these things. But my sense is that when it comes to understanding a part of the world that you've never been to, then there's little choice for most people but to rely on media. Whereas if it comes to kind of, your own pocketbook, the reality of it, regardless of what the news tells you, or when it comes to what's, how your healthcare is going or whether it exists at all. That's something that you experience sort of firsthand. And so I think that it's harder for media to, no matter what it says, overcome the sort of lived reality that people have. So I think that when it comes to the US election, it's unlikely, as so far as I can tell, that media plays a decisive role, although it certainly, shapes and in some cases drives the narratives. And I do agree with you that as Palestine and the Middle East more broadly is having an effect on the election, or it appears to be, I should say, having an effect on the election polls. So that could, be ultimately quite important because of a place like Michigan, where you have a very large Arab American population, including specifically Lebanese Americans. So I do think that is something that factors in to the election, and thus the spin that we get from media is also relevant. And I think that that's actually deeply revealing about U.S. ruling class policy, particularly the Democratic Party wing of it that is currently, in charge of the country at the federal level, is that they're essentially willing to risk, it seems anyway, it looks to me like they're willing to risk losing the election to Trump, who they claim to see as, the second coming of Hitler. They are willing to risk that in order to try to maintain or even increase U.S.-Israeli dominance across the Middle East, and that's pretty telling to me about where the American ruling class's commitments are, which I think are much more their own sort of class interests, which are enhanced by domination of politically sensitive, resource-rich areas abroad. That seems to be much more of a priority than the well-being of the American population.
You were coming up on the election, everybody. Vote.org, vote.org. You've got to find out if you have been purged from the rolls. If you have not been inclined to vote, please consider voting. Down ballot voting is very important. Go to vote.org. Find out, even if you've registered, if you're still on the rolls. If you find out that you're not on the rolls, click another link on that same website. You can get re-registered. And then you can find out what date you need to be registered by so that you can vote in this upcoming election. Dr. Gibbs, I keep saying we're coming into 2024. We are here. And it seems like the polls are all over the place.
Yeah.
But the narrative, and I thank you, Dr. Shupak, for your work. But it seems, and it seems that the corporate media's narrative, people don't trust it.
Yes, they don't. No.
And we're in direct conflict with it. Take me out to the ball game, if you will. Where does that leave us?
Well, there's no doubt. The trust in the media. I should add, this is a generalized problem. Trust in academia, my profession, is at a record low. Trust in institutions generally is at a record low. I think there are good reasons for this. I think the press has given the public good reasons to be suspicious. I think many events, the press support for the war on terror was shown to be a very considerable amount of lies by the Bush administration recycled through the press. That damaged the press's credibility. I have veterans in my class. There's a big military presence in southern Arizona, and there's a very heavy bitterness that emerged from the war on terror that has still not gone away. That leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. A lot of that reflects on the media. Then there was the financial crisis, the blowout of 2008, which was very damaging to people's living standards. And that also damaged the credibility of institutions, damaged both parties, damaged the media, damaged the economics profession at universities. There was a sense that they made it all possible. And to some extent they did. They certainly contributed to the problem. And so there've been a series of failures by the media, by institutions generally. I think Trump, and to some extent, in an ironic way, Bernie Sanders are two remarkably different, but nevertheless, in somewhat sense, similar responses to that loss of credibility. The fact that you had in 2016 and then in 2020 also, the rise of two anti-system candidates, you might call them, eventually leading to the Trump presidency. Much of this reflects disaffection based upon a perception that the public has been lied to. I think Trump is very much the wrong response to that. I'll say that. People are making a big mistake by assuming he's a good response, but it's understandable that people would want to choose somebody who is seen as almost against the whole system, who is, has this completely unusual style of presentation.
Well, I mean, they toggled between Trump and Bernie Sanders when you had open primaries in 2016, as you recall.
Well, Bernie Sanders, it does reflect in a certain sense very negatively on the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, that they were the more closed of the two parties, that the establishment rallied around Hillary Clinton and made absolutely certain, using totally unethical methods, exposed by WikiLeaks and also Donna Brazile in her memoirs, to make sure Bernie Sanders was not the nominee, even though he was far and away the more credible one. He would have done much better against Trump by all indications. And they made sure he was not the candidate. Instead, the establishment candidate, somebody who was very weak, Hillary Clinton, was the candidate. It reflects badly on the Democratic Party that they did that, and they did it again in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
But it does also...
And in 2024.
Well, yes. Right.
And honestly, and I've told everyone I went to school with Kamala Harris. I've known her 40 plus years. I like her a lot. But, I call balls and strikes.
Yeah.
The way we questioned the cognitive capabilities of the president for several years. Then we had this explosion, not an implosion, an explosion, because everybody saw it in June. And then you force this woman, you push her out onto the stage, someone who had been extremely unpopular.
That's right.
Now, to her credit, she has made silk out of a sow's ear, to use the old folks' expression. But just even the way this was done, it was not democratic. I mean, bless George Clooney's heart, but I'm like, you write a letter. What? First of all, you're an actor. I'm not saying that actors can't write.
Yep.
But I mean, okay, and you have a satellite. I don't know who you are and what you're doing. But I know this. You wrote a letter and then it became headline news. I'm just everything about this is very off. And then you have Ketanji Brown Jackson and the Supreme Court, the Supremes, saying, wait a minute, we might have violence come November 6th. Well, of course, because you're not listening to the will of the people.
That's right. I agree. It's a real possibility.
And Americans are hardwired for that. I mean, it's in the Constitution, I know you all don't like it, but it says, if you don't like this thing, you get a do-over. It's all there. I didn't come up with it. These people wrote it. And some people read it, and some people take it seriously. And that's why, we're having these revolts of the rich, but you're also seeing movements of the poor. That's why we have the story, and having the story wrong about Palestine, Israel, and the media, this is where the books that you all have written are so important now, more important than ever before, because the story has been crafted incorrectly and people are catching up to it. I'm listening to them in the morning. I'm listening to people as I'm talking to them. I'm listening to people who I never would have thought in a million years they'd be voting for Trump, but they are going to do it. And it's a lot of them. And I got Kamala Harris down by 10 points in Arizona. I'm like, okay, 1 or 2 points I could live with. I could live with that. But 10 points, I'm like, what's going on here? And then I'm watching the uncommitted hemorrhage. they're saying, I'm not going to touch her. I'm like, whoa, you guys. And I've got an escalating war that, that could lead us to the Third World War, because Israel just continues to expand this thing. And it's just very dangerous. It's dangerous for everybody. And didn't the Iranian leader say that America keep this up, you're going to feel it at home? What does that mean? That's not boots on the ground, people landing on the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic coast. That's your grid going down. There's a lot of stuff that can happen. This is unnerving. Look, I only have a few more minutes left for you guys, but I want you to have your say. David Gibbs, I got a couple of minutes for you, and then, of course, The Revolt of the Rich. Get that book, because it's the rich who are pushing this. They're the ones who are making the money off the war. They are. Boeing can't keep an airplane together, but they continue to get money out. I wish I could have such poor performance and still. No, I don't want to. I want to be excellent, but you know it. Dr. Gibbs.
Well, since you were very kind to bring up the book, I'll mention that the book has a whole chapter basically on how war is very good for the rich, actually, and that there's no doubt there are vested interests that have an interest in war. What Eisenhower termed the military-industrial complex. It's a very real thing, and you can very easily trace its influence on policies going back, as my book does, to the 70s, but also to the present. And, one of the things you had the revolt of the rich in the 70s and the 80s, as I document, but since then, more recently, I think you've had something, shall we say, a revolt of the poor countering that. Mm-hmm. Every action has a reaction. We've been seeing a reaction. And I do see, again, the groundswell of support behind both Trump and Sanders as a response to that. One of them, I think, is a reasonable response. The other is I think, a foolish one, but all the same, it's a response. I suppose, one of the things I would add is that I would like to see on opponents of American support for Israel and Israeli aggression in the Middle East, I would like to see more of a sort of more of an astute attitude towards politics. If you want to reach the public in the United States, the most effective way to do it is to emphasize how this is affecting my living standards, because that's what the public is really interested in, and underscore the fact that the enormous sums of money we have been giving to Israel over decades, which now must be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, could be better spent in improving the lives of people in this country. And that's a reasonable concern people have, that we're spending too much on guns, too little on butter. And Israel is a very big part of that equation. And that, I'd like to see opponents of what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Lebanon, more emphasizing this issue simply because I'm interested in effectiveness. And I think this would be much more effective than much of the way this is being portrayed on college campuses, for example, is to strike at the issue of how this is affecting ordinary people in their ordinary lives, also how it's likely to affect our security. And note that basically we had a terrible terrorist attack 24 years ago. And we could very easily have another one because of America's unreasonable asymmetrical support for an aggressor nation. It has effects on us collectively. And so I don't think there's a certain shyness on the left about anything suggesting nationalism, but there is a progressive aspect to nationalism.
Yeah.
I could address that progressive aspect.
Well, it depends on anything. Nationalism, all these isms are neutral. It depends on how you use them. How about that? Everything except racism and all the isms in which you isolate people and hate them. But nationalism, nothing wrong with that. There's something wrong when you use it to hurt people. But if it helps to bring about national unity, and then the national unity, good people who feel good about their country want other people to be happy. So Professor Greg Shupak, The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media. This is a book for our times. The last 2 minutes belong to you.
Okay, well, thanks again for the kind words. I think that since I'm here largely to talk about media, I will say that people should really focus their efforts on seeking out, let's just say, non-traditional sources, particularly on the Middle East, because that's one of the regions in the world where coverage is most muddled. So, if it's about Palestine and Lebanon, I mean, you can read Electronic Intifada and Mondo East, and read Professor Joseph Massad's columns at Middle East Eye. There's a lot of great places that people can look that will sort of spare you the frankly the insults to your intelligence that you'll often find on the opinion pages of the New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. And I think that I agree with Professor Gibbs about the importance of appealing to people sort of, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but self-interest, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that, in the long run, dismantling American imperialism, of which Israeli settler colonialism is a key node, is in the greater interest of everyone, on Earth, including the greater interest of the vast majority of people on Earth, including in America. And so we can also not only appeal to people's very narrow, short-term interests, which I think is important, but also we can lay out the big picture ways in which the system operates that generates these cycles of the ruling class becoming richer and the workers around the world being either in more and more precarious positions, as is happening in America and much of Canada, or outright immiserated or murdered in Palestine and Lebanon. So I mean that the kind of class logic is at work there as well. It's ordinary working people there who are getting evaporated by U.S.-made weapons. So I think that I take the point that you're making, Dr. Gibbs, but I do think that in defense of the student movement, I think that positing the Palestine liberation movement kind of within this larger context of the ways that sort of settler colonialism and racism degrade the lives of so many around the world is also effective and useful, especially for, kind of animating people and giving them a long-term systemic perspective to go along with that which looks at maybe narrower, shorter-term interests.
Well, I think that, the world has shifted and the young people are not waiting for us. They have already gone down the street on this. Nothing is as it was. Nothing is as it was. And we have these critical moments in our history when everything changes, when nothing is ever the same. If I may say so, I remember November 3rd, 1983, when Reverend Jesse Jackson announced his presidential run. He said, as of this day, nothing will ever be the same. And he was right. By the 8, 9 months later, you had a woman on the ticket. We didn't think that would happen in a major party. You had a black man who was an unapologetic populist who dared to talk about Palestinian rights and Israeli security, who was in the top tier of the presidential chain. I mean, there are critical moments in our history, everybody, when things change, and this is where we are right now. But I would urge all of us in this holy season for our Jewish brothers and sisters, let us love everybody. Let us really try to understand everybody. And you know what? You admonish people when they're wrong. We need to do that. We really need to have Israelis need to feel secure. Palestinians need justice. We don't need to have Lebanese people living on beaches. This has just got to stop. Because be very clear, the pain that other people are feeling, we're going to feel it. Ask the people in Asheville, North Carolina. This is unrelated, but my goodness, they're living like the people over in the Middle East right now. They don't have drinking water. They have no place to live. If you keep on living, it eventually comes around to you. Think about that, everybody. Professor Greg Schupak, his book, The Wrong Story, Palestine, Israel, and the Media. The Wrong Story. Professor David Gibbs, The Revolt of the Rich. Get those books, everybody, and tell everybody else to get them. Let's get on over to the next hour. Let's talk about getting our vote. 1 million Texans have been kicked off the voter rolls. That's happening all over America. Oh, yeah. You can't believe it. You can't make this stuff up. Maybe that should be the name of my podcast, huh? You can't make this stuff up. I'm Santita Jackson. Come on over to the second hour on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota.